people that have mass hallucinations all the time about a lot of things.
We're laying eyes on the actual Gospel of Judas.
Have you ever seen those portraits of Jesus Christ with his long flowing hair, serene gaze, and perfectly manicured beard?
What if the image of Jesus that millions hold dear isn't what he truly looked like?
That iconic image we all recognize didn't come from the Bible or any authenticated historical document.
The Jesus we see in many churches today, if not most, is very different from what he actually looked like.
Instead, much of Western civilization's mental picture of Jesus comes from a curious medieval forgery known as the Letter of Lentulus.
And it is one of the real untold ironies of history.
Supposedly written by a Roman governor named Publius Lentulus to Emperor Tiberius, this brief letter offers something the Gospels never provide: a detailed physical description of Jesus of Nazareth. But what's the real story behind this mysterious document that shaped how billions of people visualize Christianity's central figure?
Do you know what you have here? This is something that's only been hinted at in antiquity. For the first time ever, we're laying eyes on the actual Gospel of Judas.
Let's uncover the fascinating history of this influential forgery and how it permanently altered religious art and imagination. The Letter of Lentulus emerges from the shadows of medieval Europe like a phantom, claiming an authority it never possessed. This remarkable document purports to be an official Roman communication from one Publius Lentulus, who introduces himself as governor of Jerusalem during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. In this capacity, he claims to have directly observed Jesus Christ and felt compelled to report on this extraordinary figure to his imperial superior in Rome. What makes this origin story immediately suspect to modern scholars is that no Roman administrative position called governor of Jerusalem ever existed during this period. Judea was the proper Roman territorial designation, with its governmental seat at Caesarea Maritima, not Jerusalem. The Romans appointed prefects or procurators to this region, Pontius Pilate being the most famous example, but never a governor of Jerusalem specifically. The letter's earliest confirmed appearance comes not from antiquity but from the 13th or 14th century, where it surfaces in Latin manuscripts. Nothing resembling it exists in any Roman archives, early Christian writings, or patristic literature from the first millennium. The earliest known version appears in a collection of texts about 1300 CE, nearly 13 centuries after its claimed composition. Intriguingly, the document first gained widespread circulation during the same period when religious art was flourishing throughout Europe. The timing suggests a symbiotic relationship between the letter's description and developing artistic conventions for depicting Christ. Did artists adapt their work to match the letter's description, or was the letter crafted to legitimize existing artistic traditions? This chicken and egg question remains one of the fascinating aspects of the Lentulus letter's history. The provenance becomes even more suspicious when we consider that early Christians showed remarkably little interest in Jesus' physical appearance. The Gospels themselves offer no physical description whatsoever, a striking omission if the evangelists had any concern for recording Christ's actual appearance. This silence from authentic early sources makes the sudden appearance of a detailed Roman report all the more conspicuous. Contents revealed: Jesus described. The Letter of Lentulus provides what millions of Christians had long desired, a supposedly eyewitness account of what Jesus actually looked like. The text describes Christ in almost supernatural terms, combining physical attributes with moral qualities to create an image of divine perfection made flesh. According to Lentulus, Jesus was a man of average height and pleasing appearance, having a countenance that inspires reverence, which those who look upon him can both love and fear. Already, the description blends physical features with their emotional impact on viewers, a curious approach for what claims to be an administrative report. The letter continues with striking specificity about Jesus' hair. His hair is the color of a ripe hazelnut, falling straight down to the ears, but below the ears wavy and curled, flowing over his shoulders with a parting in the middle of his head according to the fashion of the Nazarenes. This detailed portrayal of Christ with long flowing hair would become one of the most enduring elements in Western religious art. Lentulus doesn't stop at the hairline. He describes Jesus' forehead as smooth and peaceful, his face without wrinkle or blemish moderately ruddy, and his nose and mouth faultless. The beard receives particular attention. His beard is abundant, the same color as his hair, not long but forked at the chin. These details create a composite picture of masculine beauty that aligns perfectly with Roman ideals of the period. The eyes in this description receive perhaps the most telling characterization. His eyes are blue-gray, clear and quick. This detail stands out sharply against what we know of first-century Jewish men from the Levant, who would almost certainly have had brown eyes. The blue-eyed Jesus represents a clear Europeanization of Christ's image. Beyond mere physical attributes, the letter ascribes to Jesus a perfect balance of emotional qualities. In reproof and rebuke, he is fearsome. In teaching and exhortation, gentle and lovable. He is described as never having been seen to laugh, though he often weeps. His hands and arms are described as particularly graceful and pleasing to behold. The letter concludes that Jesus is the most beautiful among the children of men, language that echoes Psalm 45, showing the author's familiarity with biblical texts. This final flourish completes the portrait of Jesus as not merely a teacher or prophet, but as the physical embodiment of perfect beauty, a conception that would dominate Western religious art for centuries to come. The medieval discovery. The letter of Lentulus didn't emerge from some dusty Roman archive or archaeological excavation. Instead, it appeared rather suddenly in European intellectual circles during the late medieval period. But why then? The timing of its discovery offers fascinating insights into the cultural and religious climate of medieval Europe. The letter first surfaces in manuscript collections from approximately the 14th century during a period of intense interest in relics and physical connections to Christ. This was the era of the Crusades and their aftermath, when Europeans were obsessed with obtaining tangible links to biblical history. Sacred objects like the Shroud of Turin, pieces of the True Cross, and even bottles of Jesus' tears or Mary's milk were highly prized across Europe. In this context, a Roman official's eyewitness description of Christ would have been considered an extraordinary discovery. The letter began circulating in Latin manuscripts, often included in collections alongside authentic ancient texts, which lent it an air of legitimacy by association. Its presentation as an official Roman document gave it particular authority in an age that revered classical knowledge. One of the earliest confirmed appearances of the letter is in the works of Ludolf of Saxony, whose Life of Christ, circa 1374, incorporated the description as if it were historical fact. The letter also appears in the writings of the 14th century mystic Nicephorus Callistus. By the 15th century, it had become widespread enough that it was frequently copied into the opening pages of psalm books and prayer books, allowing worshippers to contemplate Christ's appearance as they prayed. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century accelerated the letter's dissemination dramatically. It appeared in early printed books and was translated from Latin into various vernacular languages, reaching a much wider audience. Many educated Europeans would have encountered the letter as an established historical document rather than questioning its authenticity. Interestingly, the timing of the letter's appearance coincided with a transformation in how Christ was depicted in European art. Earlier medieval representations had shown considerable variety in Christ's appearance, but by the 14th and 15th centuries, artists were increasingly conforming to a standardized image that matched the letter's description, the long-haired, bearded Jesus that remains familiar today. Scholarly analysis, authenticity, questions. When modern scholars examine the letter of Lentulus, the verdict is unanimous. This document is unquestionably a medieval forgery. The evidence against its authenticity is overwhelming and comes from multiple disciplines: linguistics, history, political science, and biblical studies all contribute to debunking its claims. First and most damning is the letter's complete absence from any historical record before the medieval period. Had such a remarkable document, a Roman governor's eyewitness description of Jesus, actually existed in the 1st century, early Christian writers would have treasured and referenced it extensively. Church fathers like Eusebius, who meticulously catalogued all known references to Christ from non-Christian sources, make no mention of it. This silence is deafening. Linguistic analysis reveals further problems. The Latin of the letter contains terms and constructions that weren't used in classical Latin of the early imperial period but were common in medieval ecclesiastical Latin. As philologist Lorenzo Valla demonstrated when exposing the donation of Constantine as a forgery, linguistic anachronisms often provide the clearest evidence of fabrication. The political terminology in the letter is equally problematic. As mentioned earlier, there was never a Roman official with the title Governor of Jerusalem. Furthermore, no Publius Lentulus is recorded as having held any governmental position in Judea during the relevant period. The Roman administrative records for this province, while incomplete, are substantial enough that such an official would likely appear somewhere in the historical record. The description itself contains theological concepts that reflect medieval Christian thinking rather than first-century Roman perspectives. The portrayal of Jesus with qualities that simultaneously inspire love and fear, for instance, echoes medieval theological discussions about the proper attitude of Christians toward Christ, rather than how a Roman official would have assessed a provincial Jewish teacher. Perhaps most revealing is the letter's perfect alignment with medieval artistic conventions. The Jesus it describes matches exactly the way European artists were already depicting Christ, including features unlikely for a first-century Jewish man from Palestine. The blue eyes mentioned in some versions of the letter are particularly telling, a feature far more common in European populations than in the Levant. Biblical scholars point out another inconsistency. The letter describes Jesus' hair being parted according to the fashion of the Nazarenes, suggesting the author misunderstood the term Jesus of Nazareth as referring to a sect rather than a hometown. This mistake reflects medieval confusion about biblical terminology rather than the understanding a contemporary Roman official would have had. Even the letter's circulation pattern suggests forgery. It first appears in context where other proven forgeries were common, such as collections of mirabilia, wonder tales, and ecclesiastical manuscripts that included many dubious texts. Cultural impact through history. Few forgeries have shaped Western culture as profoundly as the letter of Lentulus. Despite its questionable origins, this brief text fundamentally altered how billions of people visualize Jesus Christ, influencing art, literature, film, and popular imagination across 7 centuries. In religious art, the letter's influence became particularly dominant during the Renaissance. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Dürer created Christ figures that faithfully reflected the Lentulus description: serene-faced men with flowing center-parted hair and forked beards. These images, displayed in Europe's greatest cathedrals and palaces, established a visual tradition that became nearly impossible to challenge. Alternative representations of Jesus, perhaps as a shorter man with curly hair and Semitic features, more historically plausible for a first-century Galilean Jew, simply couldn't compete with the compelling image the letter had popularized. Prayer books, home altarpieces, and religious medallions all depicted the Lentulus Jesus. This standardization created a feedback loop. The more people saw this version of Christ, the more right and natural it seemed, making alternative depictions feel inherently wrong or even heretical. Literature too embraced the Lentulus description. Medieval mystery plays and passion narratives often incorporated physical descriptions drawn directly from the letter. Later novels that featured Jesus as a character, from Ben-Hur to more recent works, frequently default to the long-haired, bearded, serene Jesus that Lentulus described. By the 19th century, the letter's description had become so deeply entrenched that it affected how people interpreted actual archaeological evidence. When the catacombs of Rome were more extensively explored, early Christian art showing Jesus as a beardless young man was dismissed as symbolic rather than realistic, simply because it contradicted the now canonical Lentulus image. The advent of film brought new power to the Lentulus description. From the silent era through contemporary biblical epics, casting directors have consistently sought actors who match the familiar image. From H.B. Warner and Cecil B. DeMille's King of Kings in 1927 to Jim Caviezel in The Passion of the Christ 2004. These cinematic representations further cemented the Lentulus Jesus in popular imagination. Even in our secular age, the letter's influence persists in unexpected ways. The Jesus hair aesthetic continues to signify spiritual enlightenment or countercultural values. From hippies to heavy metal musicians, the long-haired, bearded look popularized by the Lentulus description remains shorthand for a certain kind of male spirituality or rebellion. Perhaps most remarkably, this influence extends across denominations and even religions. Eastern Orthodox iconography, Protestant imagery, and Catholic art all converged on the Lentulus description, creating a rare point of visual unity in otherwise divided branches of Christianity. The Roman connection. Could Lentulus have existed? To truly understand the letter of Lentulus, we need to investigate whether its purported author could have even existed in the role claimed. The letter opens with Lentulus, governor of the people of Jerusalem, to the Roman Senate and people, greetings. This single line contains multiple historical problems that undermine the document's credibility. First, let's examine the Roman governance of Judea during Jesus' lifetime. From 6 CE until 41 CE, Judea was administered as a Roman province of secondary importance, governed not by a senatorial governor, but by a prefect, later called procurators of equestrian rank, who reported to the legate of Syria. The most famous of these prefects was, of course, Pontius Pilate, who governed from approximately 26 to 36 CE, precisely the period when Jesus' ministry took place. No Roman administrative position called governor of Jerusalem existed. Jerusalem was a city within the province of Judea, not a separate administrative unit. A Roman official would have identified himself as prefect of Judea, as Pilate did in contemporary inscriptions, never as governor of a single city. This mistake alone reveals the letter as the work of someone unfamiliar with Roman provincial administration. The Lentulus family name does correspond to a prominent Roman genes family line, the Cornelii Lentuli, who produced several consuls and senators. However, no Publius Lentulus is recorded as serving in any administrative capacity in Judea during the relevant period. The Roman historian Tacitus, who meticulously documented provincial appointments, makes no mention of such a person. Furthermore, the letter claims to be addressed to the Roman Senate and people. This formal address, Senatus Populusque Romanus, often abbreviated SPQR, would never have been used by a provincial administrator reporting to his superiors. A prefect of Judea would have reported directly to the legate of Syria or to the emperor himself, not to the Senate and people collectively. This misunderstanding of Roman administrative protocols again suggests a medieval European author imagining Roman governance based on limited knowledge. The letter also describes Jesus performing miracles and gaining a following, yet the purported Lentulus expresses no alarm about these potentially seditious activities. Any actual Roman administrator would have viewed a charismatic Jewish teacher with a growing following as a potential threat to Roman authority, and would have emphasized this concern rather than marveling at Jesus' appearance. If Lentulus preceded Pilate, he couldn't have witnessed Jesus' ministry, which historical consensus places during Pilate's tenure. If he served after Pilate, he would have been reporting on Jesus after the crucifixion, an event the letter fails to mention. Other ancient descriptions of Jesus. The letter of Lentulus stands in stark contrast to authentic ancient sources when it comes to describing Jesus' physical appearance. In fact, the most remarkable feature of genuine early Christian and non-Christian sources is their complete silence on what Jesus looked like. This absence makes the Lentulus letter's detailed description all the more conspicuous. The four canonical Gospels, our earliest and most detailed accounts of Jesus' life, never describe his physical appearance. They record his words, actions, and relationships in considerable detail, but offer not a single word about his height, facial features, hair, or any distinguishing marks. This silence is telling. If Jesus' appearance had been considered significant by his earliest followers, surely the Gospel writers would have mentioned it. The Apostle Paul, whose letters predate the Gospels and who had encountered followers who knew Jesus personally, never references Christ's physical appearance. In fact, Paul emphasizes in 2 Corinthians 5:16 that Christians should no longer regard Christ according to the flesh, suggesting an early Christian disinterest in Jesus' physical attributes in favor of his spiritual significance. The earliest non-biblical references to Jesus are equally silent on his appearance. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, briefly mentions Jesus but says nothing about how he looked. The The Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, who reference early Christians, provide no physical description of their founder. The first attempts to describe Jesus' appearance in authentic Christian literature come centuries after his death and reflect theological perspectives rather than historical knowledge. Church Father Tertullian, c. 160-220 CE, argued against the idea that Christ was physically attractive, suggesting instead that Isaiah's description of the suffering servant as having no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, Isaiah 53:2, applied to Jesus' appearance. Clement of Alexandria, c. 150-215 CE, similarly wrote that Jesus was physically unattractive, arguing this proved his followers were drawn by his teachings rather than his appearance. These early theological speculations directly contradict the Lentulus letters' portrait of Jesus as extraordinarily handsome. By the 4th century, opinions had shifted. Church fathers like Jerome and Augustine began suggesting that Christ must have had extraordinary physical dignity and beauty befitting his divine nature. The earliest visual representations of Jesus from the 3rd century catacombs show remarkable diversity. Some depict him as a youthful, beardless figure resembling a Roman philosopher or Apollo. Others show him with short hair and a short beard, looking more like conventional Roman men of the era. None match the distinctive long-haired figure described in the Lentulus letter. Byzantine art eventually developed more standardized representations of Christ, including the famous Pantocrator image with its intense gaze and blessing hand. These artistic conventions evolved through theological considerations and imperial influences rather than historical evidence. Why the forgery? Motivations behind the letter. What would drive someone to forge a Roman official's letter about Jesus' appearance? Understanding the potential motivations behind the letter of Lentulus reveals much about medieval religious culture and the powerful need for concrete connections to sacred history. The forgery likely emerged from a genuine spiritual impulse rather than simple deception. Medieval Christianity placed enormous emphasis on visualization as a devotional practice. Spiritual guides encourage believers to imagine themselves present at gospel scenes, mentally reconstructing the events of Christ's life in vivid detail. This practice of composition of place, later formalized in Ignatian spirituality, required visualizing Jesus himself. Without a physical description from Scripture, this visualization remained frustratingly incomplete. The letter may have begun as a devotional aid, perhaps originally presented as a pious fiction or meditation prompt that gradually acquired the status of historical document as it was copied and circulated without its original qualifications. Similar transformations occurred with other medieval texts that began as spiritual exercises but were later treated as historical accounts. Another motivation may have been legitimizing existing artistic traditions. By the 13th century, certain conventions for depicting Christ had already developed in European art. A historical document confirming these artistic choices would have provided welcome validation for iconographers and painters. The letter effectively backfilled historical justification for artistic practices that had evolved organically over centuries. Political considerations may have played a role as well. During the Crusades and their aftermath, Europeans were deeply invested in physical connections to the Holy Land. Relics, artifacts, and eyewitness accounts from biblical times carried enormous cultural and religious significance. The letter provided a seemingly direct connection to Jesus' physical presence in Jerusalem, satisfying this desire for tangible links to sacred history. The letter's timing coincides with periods of religious controversy about sacred images. The Byzantine iconoclastic controversies 726-787 CE and 814-842 CE had raised profound questions about the legitimacy of depicting Christ. While Western Christianity generally favored images, the theological foundations for this position remained contested. A Roman official's description could serve as historical justification for artistic representations, countering arguments that such images were purely inventions. The European fascination with classical authority also provided motivation. Medieval culture revered classical Rome, considering ancient Roman texts especially authoritative. By framing the description as a Roman administrative document, the forger cloaked religious imagery in the prestige of classical authority, making it more persuasive to educated audiences. Perhaps most fundamentally, the letter responded to a profound human desire to know what Jesus looked like. This desire persists today, evident in the continued fascination with artifacts like the Shroud of Turin or the facial reconstruction projects based on first-century Jewish skulls. The letter's creator recognized this deep psychological need and fulfilled it with a description that satisfied both devotional yearnings and aesthetic sensibilities of medieval Europe.